1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 42. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 14. Korosko to Abou Simbel, Part 3. All hands being safe on board, we pushed off at once, leaving about a couple of hundred disconsolate dealers on the bank. A long-drawn howl of disappointment followed in our wake. Those who had sold and those who had not sold were alike wronged, ruined, and betrayed. One woman tore wildly along the bank, shrieking and beating her chest. Foremost among the sellers, she had parted from her gold brow pendant for a good price, but was inconsolable now for the loss of it. It often happened that those who had been most eager to trade were readiest to repent of their bargains. Even so, however, their cupidity outweighed their love of finery. Moved once or twice by the lamentations of some dark damsel who had sold her necklace at a handsome profit, we offered to annul the purchase. But it invariably proved that, despite her tears, she preferred to keep the money. The palms of Deir and of the rich desert beyond were the finest we saw throughout the journey. Straight and strong and magnificently plumed, they rose to an average height of 70 or 80 feet. These superb plantations supply all Egypt with saplings, and contribute a heavy tax to the revenue. The fruit, sun-dried and shriveled, is also sent northwards in large quantities. The trees are cultivated with strenuous industry by the natives, and owe as much of their perfection to laborious irrigation as to climate. The foot of each separate palm is surrounded by a circular trench into which the water is conducted by a small channel about 14 inches in width. Every palm grove stands in a network of these artificial runlets. The reservoir from which they are supplied is filled by means of a sakia, or water wheel, a primitive and picturesque machine consisting of two wheels, the one set vertically to the river and slung with a chain of pots, the other a horizontal cog turned sometimes by a camel, but more frequently in Nubia by a buffalo. The pots, which go down empty, dip under the water and come up full, feed a sloping trough which in some places supplies a reservoir, and in others communicates at once with the irrigating channels. These sakias are kept perpetually going, and are set so close just above Deir that the writer counted a line of 15 within the space of a single mile. There were probably quite as many on the opposite bank. The sakias creak atrociously, and their creaking ranges over an unlimited gamut. From morn till dewy eve, from dewy eve till morn, they squeak, they squeal, they grind, they groan, they creak. Heard after dark, sakia answering to sakia, their melancholy chorus makes night hideous. To sleep through it is impossible. Being obliged to moor a few miles beyond Deir, and having lain awake half the night, we offered a sakia driver a couple of dollars if he would let his wheel rest till morning. But time and water are more precious than even dollars at this season, and the man refused. All we could do, therefore, was to punt into the middle of the river, and lie off at a point as nearly possible equidistant from our two nearest enemies. The native dearly loves the tree which costs him so much labor, and thinks it the chef d'oeuvre of creation. When Allah made the first man, says an Arab legend, he found he had a little clay to spare, so with that he made the palm. And to the poor Nubian, at all events, the gifts of the palm are almost divine, supplying food for his children, thatch for his hovel, timber for his water wheel, ropes, matting, cups, bowls, and even the strong drink forbidden by the Prophet. The date wine is yellowish white, like whiskey. It is not a wine, however, but a spirit, coarse, fiery, and unpalatable. Certain trees, as for instance the perky little pine of the German wald, are apt to become monotonous, but one never wearies of the palm. Whether taken singly or in masses, it is always graceful, always suggestive. To the sketcher on the Nile it is simply invaluable. It breaks the long parallels of river and bank, and composes with the stern lines of Egyptian architecture as no other tree in the world could do. Subjects, indeed! Said once upon a time an eminent artist to the present writer. Fiddlesticks about subjects! Your true painter can make a picture out of a post and a puddle. Substitute a palm, however, for a post, combine it with anything that comes first, a camel, a shadoof, a woman with a water jar upon her head, and your picture stands before you ready made. Nothing more surprised me at first than the colour of the palm frond, which painters of Eastern landscapes are wont to depict of a hard bluish tint, like the colour of a yucca leaf. Its true shade is a tender, bloomy, sea-green grey, difficult enough to match, but in most exquisite harmony with the glow of the sky and the gold of the desert. The palm groves kept us company for many a mile, backed on the Arabian side by long level ranges of sandstone cliffs horizontally stratified, like those of the Thebaid. We now scarcely ever saw a village, only palms and sakias and sandbanks in the river. The villages were there but invisible, being built on the verge of the desert. Arable land is too valuable in Nubia for either the living to dwell upon it or the dead to be buried in it. At Ibrim, a sort of ruined Ehrenbreitstein on the top of a grand precipice overhanging the river, we touched for only a few minutes in order to buy a very small shaggy sheep which had been brought down to the landing place for sale. But for the breeze that happened just then to be blowing, we should have liked to climb the rock, and see the view in the ruins, which are part modern, part Turkish, part Roman, and little, if at all, Egyptian. There are also some sculptured and painted grottoes to be seen in the southern face of the mountain. They are, however, too difficult of access to be attempted by ladies. Alfred, who went ashore after quail, was drawn up to them by ropes, but found them so much defaced as to be scarcely worth the trouble of a visit. We were now only 34 miles from Abu Simbel, but making slow progress, and impatiently counting every foot of the way. The heat at times was great, frequent and fitful spells of Khamsun wind alternating with a hot calm that tried the trackers sorely. Still we pushed forward a few miles at a time, till by and by the flat-topped cliffs dropped out of sight and were again succeeded by volcanic peaks, some of which looked loftier than any of those about Dacca or Korosko. Then the palms ceased, and the belt of cultivated land narrowed to a thread of green between the rocks and the water's edge, and at last there came an evening when we only wanted breeze enough to double 2 or 3 more bends in the river. "Is it to be Abu Simbel to-night?" we asked for the 20th time before going down to dinner. To which Rais Hassan replied, "Aywa," certainly, but the pilot shook his head and added, "Bukra," tomorrow. When we came up again the moon had risen but the breeze had dropped. Still we moved, impelled by a breath so faint that one could scarcely feel it. Presently even this failed. The sail collapsed, the pilot steered for the bank, the captain gave the word to go aloft, when a sudden puff from the north changed our fortunes, and sent us out again with a well-filled sail into the middle of the river. None of us, I think, will be likely to forget the sustained excitement of the next 3 hours. A light more mysterious and unreal than the light of day filled and overflowed the wide expanse of river and desert. We could see the mountains of Abu Simbel standing, as it seemed, across our path in the far distance, a lower one first, then a larger, then a series of receding heights, all close together, yet all distinctly separate. That large one, the mountain of the great temple, held us like a spell. For a long time it looked a mere mountain like the rest. By and by, however, we fancied we detected a something, a shadow, such a shadow as might be cast by a gigantic buttress. Next appeared a black speck no bigger than a porthole. We knew that this black speck must be the doorway. We knew that the great statues were there, though not yet visible, and that we must soon see them. For our sailors, meanwhile, there was an excitement of a chase. The Bagstones and 3 other dahabeahs were coming up behind us in the path of the moonlight. Their galley fires glowed like beacons on the water, the nearest about a mile away, the last a spark in the distance. We were not in the mood to care much for racing to-night, but we were anxious to keep our lead and be first at the mooring place. To run upon a sandbank at such a moment was like being plunged suddenly into cold water. Our sail flapped furiously. The men rushed to the punting poles. 4 jumped overboard and shoved with all the might of their shoulders. By the time we got off, however, the other boats had crept up half a mile nearer, and we had hard work to keep them from pressing closer on our heels. At length the last corner was rounded, and the great temple stood straight before us. The façade, sunk in the mountain side like a huge picture in a mighty frame, was now quite plain to see. The black speck was no longer a porthole, but a lofty doorway. Last of all, though it was night and they were still not much less than a mile away, the four colossi came out, ghost-like, vague and shadowy in the enchanted moonlight. Even as we watched them they seemed to grow, to dilate, to be moving towards us out of the silvery distance. It was drawing on towards midnight when the Philae at length ran in close under the great temple. Content with what they had seen from the river, the rest of the party then went soberly to bed, but the painter and the writer had no patience to wait till morning. Almost before the mooring rope could be made fast, they had jumped ashore and begun climbing the bank. They went and stood at the feet of the colossi, and on the threshold of that vast portal beyond which was darkness. The great statues towered above their heads. The river glittered like steel in the far distance. There was a keen silence in the air, and towards the east the Southern Cross was rising. To the strangers who stood talking there with bated breath, the time, the place, even the sound of their own voices seemed unreal. They felt as if the whole scene must fade with the moonlight and vanish before morning. End of section 42.